Hi everybody, it's Alex, and I figured I would talk a little bit about the butterflies and moths that I anticipate raising this year and having extra of for educators who are looking to do their work with different classroom organisms, perhaps show some life cycles and have living components to their classroom. So I took the liberty out of making a PowerPoint presentation which has the different species that I currently have or that I can very easily obtain from the wild around me. And so why don't we get into it? Let's start with our format here. I'm going to have the species, its family, which will become important, as you'll see. The hosts, or basically what food you can offer to the larvae, what the adults feed on, the difficulty level, the stage that I would have to offer, when I would be offering it, and how likely I will be to have it. It's on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being very unlikely, but it's a possibility, and 10 being almost certainly going to have it. So we'll start with the silk moth Eupicardia colletta. It's in the Saturniidae. The larvae feed mostly on privet, lilac, and cherry. There are a few other hosts. It's a species that's found in the southwestern United States, and some of the native plants such as pepperbush serve as a food plant for them. Like all Saturniids, the adults do not need to be fed. There are no hosts available, no food sources utilized by the adults. It's intermediate in its difficulty level. There are a few things about this species that you'll want to keep in mind. First of all, this species is somewhat disease-prone when reared indoors, and you'll want to keep crowding at a minimum and keep the containers that you're rearing them in very clean. And they can be very spotty with their emergence. It's a great species to have students look at the caterpillars and get a rearing experience. However, don't expect emergence anytime soon. I'll probably have eggs of this species to send to people starting in August. Generally what happens with this species is you get some emergence in April or May, you get some emergence in August, and mine generally emerge July or August. And even though I have a good number of cocoons, I usually only get a couple of pairings, and so my likelihood of having the species is going to be a 6. I have some cocoons, but whether or not they will actually emerge and mate with one another is still up in the air. It is a cool species, especially in the larval stage. Next is Haploaclymene. This is a nice little tiger moth. I have a good number of overwintering caterpillars. Yes, it overwinters as a caterpillar. It feeds on a number of different plants. It's fairly polyphagous. It eats goldenrod, Joe pieweed, echinacea, various other daisies and members of the daisy family, privet, oak, and some other plants. You can throw a number of different things in the containers with the larvae and they'll feed on them. Like most tiger moths, they don't feed as adults. You don't need to worry about feeding adults. It's a very easy species to work with. I will be sending eggs to people who want them. This will be occurring June or July, and again, about a 6, maybe a little bit more likely than the colettas that I'll have these guys. Again, I have overwintering larvae that are doing fairly well, so if all goes according to plan, they'll emerge from their overwintering state in April, finish up their development throughout the spring, and then emerge as adults in the summertime. Papilio troilus, the spicebush swallowtail. Classic animal for a lot of different rearing. It is a fun species to work with. Not my favorite of the swallowtails, but it's up there. Its host plants are spicebush and sassafras. Adults have to be fed a nectar solution. If your intention is to do rear and release, where the adult emerges and you just release it outside, you don't have to worry too much about feeding the adults. However, if you're going to keep the adults for an extended period of time, you will need to feed them, or otherwise they'll starve to death. The caterpillars grow about 2 inches long. They have like this green color, and then they turn yellow right before they pupate. They have several generations a year over here. from late April onwards, I'll have eggs or pupae available for people who want them. Don't be afraid to ask. I have a good number right now that are sitting in the fridge as pupae, and I plan on getting some unrelated pairings and breeding them and keeping them going throughout the summer. So if anybody needs these guys at any given time, just let me know. If you want just to have butterflies emerging so you can release them, you're better off getting pupae. If you'd actually like to raise the caterpillars, this is not too difficult of a species to raise from the egg, so I will have those available. Next we have the eastern tent caterpillar, Malacosoma americanum. This is the lastiocampid moth. It feeds on cherry and a number of other rosaceous plants such as apple, plum, and other prunus, pear, downy serviceberry, and a few other things. Like all lastiokampids, the adults do not feed. It is a little bit more of a difficult species to rear. The reason I say that is because this species lives socially in large webs that need a good amount of space to accommodate. I usually keep my webs in large open-air cages, and I have tubes leading to foraging setups that are a little bit more closed so that the cherry doesn't wilt as quickly. I use copious amounts of bleach on all my materials for this species just to keep disease incidence at a minimum, and they have a single generation a year. I will maintain them through the spring, and I will then have egg masses that anybody can have if they wish to have them. There are a couple of things that you need to keep in mind. This is a species that will emerge very early in the spring. They are adapted to feed on very young host foliage, so you might as well go with the flow and take the eggs out once you start to see the host's buds breaking and bursting open and growing. You don't want to delay the hatching of this species, or you will not have success rearing them. It's not the easiest species to keep alive. I will give you step-by-step instructions if you wish. However, you do want to keep in mind that it is a little bit harder to keep alive and going. I will have probably around June, late June, I'd say, and I will very likely have them. Nice. My favorite sphingid is Durapsomyron. This is a small sphinx moth that is very nice looking. The caterpillars are cool. They have this weird swelling at the very end of the body by the head, and they grow very rapidly, very easy to take care of. There are a couple of things we need to talk about with this species, however. It's a species that feeds on the Vitaceae, grape, Virginia creeper, Boston ivy, and related plants. Adults don't need to be fed in order to successfully reproduce. However, you can feed them. They will feed from a number of different food sources like nectars, rotting fruits, even beer and other fermented food products. They'll drink sweat off of your hands. They don't really need food, and some generations just simply won't accept food. It's a little bit of an oddball. Not too difficult to rear, however, the larvae can become cannibalistic if they are not properly fed. So make sure you give them some space, enough food, make sure things stay clean so that you don't get disease sweeping through. I'd have eggs or pupae available June onward. I will preface this by saying my colony has struggled a little bit with its hatch rates, and as far as the eggs go, I'll get adults emerge and mate, and some of the eggs just won't hatch. That is probably due to inbreeding. I have gotten some outbreeding, which has slowed this, and it was less of a problem in the last generation last year than a few earlier generations. However, do keep in mind that there is a possibility that I will lose the colony if I don't keep getting enough unrelated pairings from wild or extended stock, and there's not really much I can do about that. It's hit or miss with this species. I'll get adults and I'll set them out to attract wild mates, and sometimes wild males will come to my females, sometimes they won't. Sometimes I'll set a light out and get some males in to throw in the cage with the females. It doesn't always work out, and so too many generations of inbreeding does seem to be detrimental to this species, and so it's going to be a toss-up here. But do stay tuned. If you are interested, it's a charming little sphinx moth. Very nice beginner sphinx for people to rear. They're fairly small. They're about an inch across. They're not huge like the tobacco hornworms, but they are a nice species to work with. Amorpha juglandis, or the walnut sphinx. This is a really cool sphinx moth. It does not feed as an adult, and the caterpillar feeds on walnut, hickory, birch, sometimes oak, and a few other things. One of the coolest things about these guys is once the caterpillars get to a certain size, about half grown, they have the ability to produce a whistling sound, and this is a defense against predators. If you handle them and are working with them, you will notice this. And it is cool for children to learn about different defenses, maybe have a cool whistling, squeaking caterpillar. This is a species that I have reared for multiple generations and have had fairly good success with. The caterpillars can be a bit disease prone if you're not careful, and so you will want to keep an eye on them. What generally happens here is I'll get a spring generation, and then a small percentage of the pupae will emerge again in the summer and attract wild mates and produce another generation. But the majority will sit through the winter after they pupate, and so I have a good backlog of pupae now. I would be sending eggs starting in May, so that's going to be an option for people. Calassamia promethea, or the Promethea moth. This is Saturniid, so again, the adults don't feed. Compared to other members of the genus Calassamia, this is a fairly polyphagous moth. The caterpillars will eat cherry, they'll eat spicebush, sassafras, tulip tree, and maybe a few other plants. I like to feed them spicebush, but you can honestly use any of these other plants without too many difficulties. I do want to caution you, if you want to go with this species, you'll want to contact me for rearing bags, which are just these cloth bags that you put over the plant material. I can quickly make you some and give you them as well. The caterpillars don't particularly like being raised inside. They like to be outside where they're getting airflow, day-nighttime temperature shifts, UV light, things like that. They are very disease prone, they're very easily stressed. It's not the easiest species, and if you're going to raise them indoors, you really want to space them out. You want to feed them cherry because that's going to release the least amount of moisture in the container you're rearing them inside of. You want to use enough ventilation and airflow to keep condensation at a minimum. It's not the easiest species. They are rewarding. The caterpillars are really spectacular. I would send eggs starting in June. I have some cocoons, so there is a good chance I'll have some extra. I don't know exactly just yet, but if you are interested in them, just let me know, and I will let you know if I happen to have them. Then we get to Lepidoptera exigua. This is a moth in the Noctuidae. It's known as the beet armyworm. It is extremely polyphagous. It will feed on most crop plants. Lettuce works fairly well for them. There's also an artificial diet that is sold that you can utilize for classroom rearing. This is a species that we use here as a feeder species. We raise copious numbers of caterpillars so that we can feed them to our assassin bugs that we're raising. We can feed them to frogs. We can feed them to a number of other things. So it's a good feeder food for class pets, especially class pets that are insectivores. Very easy to rear. You don't need to feed the adults, although they will feed. We get them to lay their eggs without any food, and we find that that just kind of keeps their numbers under control. Because of how quickly the eggs hatch, I would send pupae. I have a good colony of them now. I'd send the pupae, whenever you would need them. All that you would have to do is get a paper bag, put the pupae in a little cup of moist paper toweling or cotton, put it in the paper bag and close it, and about a week and a half to 2 weeks later, the inside of the paper bag will be covered in egg masses, and you'll have starting material for a colony. Really easy species. They're very tiny. They're kind of cute looking. They have an interesting appearance. This is another good time to do simple classroom experiments or educational experiments. Under the proper conditions, they only spend about a week as larvae. If you really wanted to do something like houseplant experiments where you see, does it grow faster on lettuce or cabbage? Does it grow faster on, this versus that? Or a number of other experimental factors. You could very easily utilize this species, manipulate their development for the classroom. So keep that in mind. Next we go to the monarch, Danaeus plexippus. This is an emphalid butterfly, and it's kind of a classic butterfly that people like to work with. Everybody can recognize it, and there's a desire to increase their populations. They feed on milkweeds, and the adults will need to feed on nectars. The difficulty level is intermediate, and the reason for this is because there are a number of pathogens and parasites that can affect monarchs, particularly in captivity where they're kept in more confined quarters and with less than ideal hygiene that we need to address. Now, there are a couple things that I need to preface any monarch offering with. First of all, while everything else I will ship to people throughout the U.S., I cannot ship monarchs to Florida or anywhere west of the Rocky Mountains, and that is because I don't want to send individuals from populations in my area to distinctive populations in those two regions, because you don't want to mix individuals from one population that has its own set of adaptations to a variety of conditions with other individuals, because to water down the specific adaptations of the individuals in the other populations, and I don't want to risk anything getting out into the environment to cause things like that to happen. It would be incredibly irresponsible. Now, I should have these guys starting May, maybe June, slightly later. You'll have to contact me to see what's available. They're very prolific butterflies. I have a colony of them now that I'm working on wintering, and we'll obviously have them again when the season draws on. We definitely want to have a conversation about how to properly take care of monarchs to avoid disease issues. Then we go to the viceroy, Limenitis archipus, which is a monarch mimic. Interestingly enough, viceroys are toxic themselves. They're not Batesian mimics, they're actually Millerian mimics. The larvae will feed on willow and poplar. The adults are a bit polyphagous, and they'll drink nectar, but they'll also drink from rotting fruits and feces and carcasses and a number of other things. They can be a little bit more difficult to rear. I had a lot of early mortality, and I have a setup now where I'm working on reducing that. I may have some extra eggs starting in July. They grow more quickly than monarchs when they're not overwintering. They don't lay as many eggs, but they start off as a larger caterpillar than the monarch. And I think that the personalities of these guys are a little bit better. The thing that you'll want to keep in mind, I'm assuming people will just raise to release the adults, is the adult males are highly territorial, and if you keep too many adult males in the same cage, you will have stress-related mortality, so just keep that in mind. It's a species that I like to work with, and so I may end up having a good number of extras. Now, we're going to talk about Luna moths, Actaeus luna. Now, this species I did used to have a sizable colony of, and I would maintain them for generations. This past year, I kind of got rid of them just because I didn't have much of a use for them anymore. And then we ended up, one of the projects I was working on campus needed them again. So we have them again. Right now we have adults that were emerging and breeding with each other. What I'm hoping is to get a generation through the rest of the winter on artificial diet and then start them up again on their host plant material in the spring. And so there is a chance they'll have some eggs available in May or later in the summer. They have several generations a year, and they're fairly easy to rear up. Very good species for rearing indoors and for having very large caterpillars for students to see. If you rear them at warm temperatures on walnut indoors, you can get them to pupation in 3 weeks, and so it's good for an end-of-year rearing project. As with all Saturniids, the adults don't feed. The larval hosts include sweet gum, hickory, walnut, birch, persimmon, and a few other things depending on what population you're working with. Our population is specifically adapted to juglandaceous plants, walnut and hickory, but you'll probably get them through on the other things. Sweet gum works really well, and it's a very distinctive plant, so keep that in mind. Now we go to the polyphemus moth. It's another saturniid that I've reared before. I didn't have them for a while, and we have a need for them now, so we got cocoons. So we're going to raise another generation indoors in artificial diet. Whether or not it will work is still up in the air, so stay tuned on that. I would have them starting in May or June, and I'd be sending eggs. It's a little bit less likely than the Lunas just because they can be a little bit more of a pain to deal with. They're best reared outdoors. They can be fairly disease prone if you're not careful. And when I rear them down here in Rhode Island, where I am, I have a harder time than when I rear them in my hometown. But they're fairly polyphagous. Their favorite hosts include oak, maple, and birch, but they'll eat a whole wide range of other things. As with all saturniids, they don't feed as adults. Now, here is another species that I may have, the Cecropia moth, Hyalophyra cecropia. It's a saturniid as well. Adults don't feed. Larvae have a number of different hosts, such as cherry, maple, ash, and willow. I don't recommend this for people who have never worked with caterpillars before. They need to be reared outdoors, or they need to be reared indoors with a whole bunch of antibiotics given to them to prevent disease and to get them through. It is a real pain to work with. I generally will start off with hundreds of eggs and only get a handful of caterpillars through. I will get the caterpillars out in rearing bags on their hosts and keep them at very low densities, and I'll have some that do wonderfully and then some that perish for no rhyme or reason. And it is a tricky species to work with, and I don't recommend them if you really need something to work, and I don't recommend them if you've never worked with a moth before. I may have extra eggs in May or June. No guarantees. I'm really doubtful of it, but it is something to keep in mind. And that brings me to another species that I will have, and that is very easy, the silkworm, Bombyx mori. It's in the Bombicidae, which is a close relative family of the Saturniidae. As with the Saturniids, these guys don't feed as adults. The only thing the caterpillars will eat is mulberry or an artificial diet that is based on mulberry. Really easy species to rear. There are a couple of precautions you want to take with these guys just to prevent disease, but they can generally be raised under cramped conditions indoors without any problems because it's a domesticated species. I have a ton of eggs sitting in my fridge right now. You can use them as class pets. I use them mostly as feeders, good food for frogs and a number of other creatures. Whenever anybody wants any, just let me know. I will send you some eggs. You can put the eggs in the fridge until you're ready for them to hatch for you. And very easy to work with. Now I'm going to go through a couple of species that are especially abundant in my town that I can easily catch adults to get eggs from or something like that for anybody who may want them. So first is a tiger moth known as Spilosoma virginica. It is the Virginia tiger moth. It is a charming little white tiger moth that has very cute woolly bear-like caterpillars that are very easy to handle. Kids will love them. I like to use this species for various show and tell displays and things like that I do. They'll eat a number of garden weeds like dandelion and plantain. For some reason, a lot of tiger moths love to eat common evening primrose, which, as its name implies, is a very common plant. Adults don't need to feed on anything. Very easy species. I can easily get eggs in May or June. Don't be afraid to ask. I'll keep an eye out. Hephantria cunea is the fall webworm. Even though it's called the fall webworm, they have 3 generations a year where I am found, where I live. They will feed on a number of ericaceous plants like blueberry and mulberry. I've seen them feed on willow. They'll eat apple and cherry and a number of other plants. They form distinctive webs that cause some considerable ugly damage to their host plants. They can be a little bit tricky to rear just because they do need to be kept in groups when they're younger, and it can be hard to accommodate that. But they eat a number of different things, and they're not too difficult to deal with. I can send eggs starting in May, and I'll have no problem finding them if anybody really wants them. Everybody loves woolly bears. This is Pyrarctia isabella. It is an erebid. Like all tiger moths, not all erebids are tiger moths, but most tiger moths are erebids. Like all tiger moths, they don't feed as adults. Larvae are very easily reared on dandelion, plantain, common evening primrose, etc. Like most tiger moths, they can be reared in fairly cramped conditions without too many consequences. I'll start seeing them in June and July. Easy enough to catch a few females and get eggs from, so don't be afraid to ask. The banded tussock moth, Halosodota tesselaris. Like all tussock moths, they don't feed as adults. This is an erebid tussock moth. Well, it's more closely related to tiger moths than true tussock moths. Oak and hickory are the best houseplants to use for them. They can be a little tricky to start the caterpillars off eating, but once you get them going, they are pretty trouble-free. You can have some pupil mortality, so you want to be careful of that. I'll have eggs, hopefully. Sometimes you catch females that just don't lay eggs for you. It's not the easiest thing to work with, but it's also not too difficult, and for, kind of exploratory work that you might want to do in a classroom, it's something that you might consider. Daitana drexelii is a nododontid moth. Nododontidae is the family of prominent moths. It's a cute little moth that can cause a lot of destruction to blueberries. Their host plants are blueberries, huckleberries, and related members of the Vaccinoideae tribe of the Ericaceae. They don't feed as adults. Very easy to rear the larvae. I can very easily find the larvae and send pupae off. No guarantee they'll emerge this year. You may have to wait till next year. I'll start seeing them in July, and I'll almost certainly encounter them. Oh yes, here's another sphingid that I see quite a bit. It's Paeonius myops, or the small-eyed sphinx. This is a species of sphingid that doesn't feed as an adult. Can be a little tricky when they're young. I feed them cherry. The caterpillars when they're young require some high humidity, and that causes some problems of its own. However, once they start establishing and getting larger, they're pretty easy to take care of. I should have eggs for people who are interested. Starting in May, they fly fairly early from a sphingid standard. And so I will definitely keep an eye out for people who may want them. Really good species to have in the classroom. I like having a number of different Lepidopteran species to show diversity in the local caterpillar fauna. It's good for people to see the different colors, different shapes, different sizes, things like that. Alright, so that's my rundown for now. I wanted to mention a couple of things for this effort here. I am generally okay sharing materials with people for various purposes, particular education. I maintain a lot of Lepidopterans, aside from the ones that I'm working for research purposes on, and maybe I'll make a video later explaining kind of some of the experiments that I've run and some of the colonies that I have. But classrooms are always better with some sort of live animal, and various caterpillars are always, appreciated by students, and sometimes it's called for depending on what kind of activity you're trying to run. And so for people looking to have some caterpillars and moths and things like that going in their classroom, or for other educational things like outreach and camp programs and things like that. Really great. You can do all sorts of things with these insects, and so please just let me know if you are interested in obtaining anything, if I have any recommendations, if you need help kind of finding host plant material, getting together some of the supplies that are necessary. I have a care guide that outlines from every life cycle stage how to take care of some of these animals and what to do with them, what kinds of setups to use, this and that. And so what I will do is I will put the link to that in the description of this video, and so you can go to that. I will have the email address, the free education, is it freeeducatorresources@gmail.com, for people to send me an email if you're interested, and just some other supplementary information will be in the description. And I did want to just mention a couple things. One, I'm shipping only through the US. I'm only going to be shipping native species, obviously, because there are laws against having non-native things, and I just want to be careful not to be breaking any laws. I will provide stuff for people who are in the US and who are interested. I can't ship monarchs outside of the population that I'm working with range, as I said when I talked about the monarchs, just for gene mixing reasons. Some of the other species, you probably want to be careful about releasing material out into your area, just because inbreeding depression is a problem, but so is outbreeding depression. You can actually dilute specific traits that are important for that population in your given area by introducing individuals that have other traits. So you want to be careful of that. Please don't hesitate to contact me. I will help with whatever you're trying to get done. I can make some cloth bags for people who are wanting to do some outdoor rearing stuff. And I will probably make a video series kind of going step by step through the life cycle of various lepidopterans, so people can kind of see in action how these different cages, setups, bins, cups, what have you, are done, so that you have a better idea of how to rear and what things to do. I am not going to really ask for anything in return. If you're so inclined to do anything in return, what's more helpful than just paying me is seeing if you can get a hold of unrelated bloodlines of some of the species I'm rearing, so that I can keep things fresh and prevent inbreeding. If you're so inclined to help in any way, maybe you feel a need to do something in return, that's fine. I don't want to disregard that. And I know that some people are of the mindset that you have to pay to get something quality, or that, you get what you pay for. I assure you that I will only be sending materials that I'm confident is healthy and, will do well for you. And I'm going to offer any kind of support that you might need in troubleshooting, rearing, and things like that. So I hope that people take me up on my offer and find this helpful. Thank you for watching.